we all understand the kind of the crisis that we are facing globally in terms of changing climate and biodiversity conservation. And we have already, in terms of carbon emission, we have already surpassed 400 ppm concentration at the carbon dioxide concentration at the atmosphere. So, and these impacts are transboundary. So, and in one hand, we have countries, they are aspirational. The developing world is very, very aspirational because, they are looking at their wish list is growing because, they have a whole range of things to address, from poverty to, to conventional development. So there's a thin line. Of course, we understand there's a thin line. You don't even realize while you are growing, you don't really know that you have actually crossed the limit. So how do you know? I mean, what are policymakers should do to understand and value that thin line, and then draw that, okay, enough is enough. We cannot grow beyond this point. So that is one question. The other question is, when it comes to degrowth, it's kind of a new and very, very, emerging topic, to say the least. So how can we probably at a global level, think about influencing our lawmakers and policymakers to actually adopt and design policies and regulatory and bring in regulatory reforms at national, regional, and international level. So what should we do about influencing these set of policymakers? Over to you, you both, Jason and Laura. Thank you.
I'd love to jump in and just answer that last question there about strategy. So, I mean, what's interesting is that over the past 2 years, I mean, the climate conversation has changed really rapidly and really come into popular consciousness. And I think that, I mean, this is clearly due to popular grassroots activism, right? I mean, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion here in the UK, the Sunrise Movement in the US. These are very powerful movements in terms of changing the discourse. Now, the thing is that we know that the kinds of policies we need to actually achieve the goals we're after, right? Like staying under 1.5 degrees, which is very, very difficult, but possible to achieve, requires, really significant policy changes, like a quite significant transformation of our society and economy, right? In the direction of post-growth and degrowth ideas. So how do we manage to accomplish that? Like, it's easy for leaders to say, I'm going to commit to net zero by 2050. Much more difficult for them to introduce the policies that requires, given the kinds of transformations that this entails, right? So we have to push for significantly more ambition. How do we do that? My main thing is this. I think that environmentalist movements alone can't do this. There has to be an alliance with working class movements, specifically trade unions. Now, historically, there's been some conflict between them, right? On the grounds that for unions, the idea is jobs, 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 and I understand that. Of course, I'm part of unions myself, and these are our demands. Livelihoods are important, but there's this assumption that we need growth in order to generate jobs and improve livelihoods, et cetera, et cetera. This is a problematic assumption in the high-income nations. And I think that we need to change our framework on that. So let's call instead for full employment through a shorter working week, through a public job guarantee, or take the question of livelihood off the table with a universal basic income or whatever it might be. Expand public services with a universal basic services approach. The key thing here is that we have to take the question of jobs and livelihoods off the table. And once that's the case, we can have an open conversation about scaling down unnecessary parts of the economy, i.e. a post-growth future, without worrying about the effect on employment and so on, right? And I mean, really, this is so essential because think about it. We have difficulty even scaling down airport runway plans or coal plants because we're worried about jobs, right? And so, as a consequence, the working class movements end up having to align with capital in the interest of growth. And this is a problem. So the more that we can take the question of jobs off the table through universal guarantee to livelihood, the more we open up space to have a conversation about how our economy can change. So I really think that environmentalist movements have to align and create alliances directly with working class formations in order to build this repertoire of alternatives out.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Laura,
Thanks,
if you want
thanks,
to add.
Jason. I think sort of an alignment with the National Union of Mine Workers in South Africa sort of really talks to that point that you're raising there, and sort of how we need to form these alliances. I'm going to try and go for the first question, so that's a nice sort of delineation between us. And I was last night listening to the Coode Street podcast, which I find quite fascinating because I am also a bit of a sci-fi fantasy nerd. And Ken Liu, this was an interview from last year, was talking about how the narrative actually comes before the institutional change. And I think that that's a really important sort of emphasis. And he comes at this from sort of being from a legal perspective, sort of talking about how court cases were able to make sort of really interesting constitutional decisions because the time was right. So it wasn't about that institutional change sort of being able to sort of happen because that's how the institutions were structured, but it's because the narrative had reached a point where it was no longer tenable for the institutions to function in the ways that they did. And I think we've seen this with a lot of movements, whether it was sort of the feminist movement, there was the sort of the decolonial movement. We're seeing it more and more now with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the Rhodes Must Fall movement that we had in South Africa, you know, that the narrative has come to a point where actually the institutions are no longer fit, and so they need to be changed. You know, you don't come in with, we're going to change this institution and then suddenly expect everyone to buy in to a new narrative just because there's been an institutional change. And I think that that's a really important thing to emphasize when we're talking about social equality, sort of the environmental movement, etc. And so with that in mind, talking to this idea of aspirations, I think becomes really interesting, because aspirations are part of the narratives or the stories that we tell ourselves about where it is we want to be in the future. And so, I mean, I grew up in South Africa, sort of completely fixated sort of in a post-apartheid South Africa around an American dialogue, right? So sort of everyone wanted to be American, the sort of the white picket fence with the 2.4 kids and the dog or the whatever in the suburbs. And you know, this tucks in really nicely with sort of a growth capitalist idea of what it is we aspire to be in the future. And this is the catch-up game that the global South is really playing. They're not playing on their own terms, they're playing on terms to be like the global North. And it's really difficult to tell them, no, you shouldn't actually be doing this because you're going to be fundamentally undermining all of the natural and social capital that you actually still have in these parts of the world that haven't actually sort of been taken up for the capitalist colonial regime. And so I think what we actually need to talk about is what are the narratives that actually need to change in the North around sort of how they define their own aspirations. And this is sort of where the degrowth movement, I think, sort of has a really important role to play, and the alliances that Jason was talking about. And so sort of talking about, I asked this question in a seminar a few years back, like who actually needs to be decolonized? Actually, I think it's also largely a conception of the wealthy high-income countries that really need to take some of these ideas on board. And so how do we start to change that narrative? And I think once you see that shift, you're able to see an opening up or a space for these plural ways of being more progressive actually coming up. And we can actually go true to our roots in the South, which is, I think, a very different kind of aspiration in many cases to sort of those defined by a Western ontology. But we've lost a lot of that. And I think we need to be able to go back to understand what those progressive futures actually look like. And so my sort of solution space for this is only partial, right? This is a transformation agenda. I definitely don't have all of the solutions, but what I've seen working really, really well, if you think about popular culture, for example, are just the kinds of stories we tell ourselves in books and in Netflix sort of documentaries, or even sort of Netflix shows that sort of everyone is able to see. And I think that the power of science fiction in particular and fantasy to really allow us to disassociate from the present and imagine sort of a really fundamental different reconfiguration of social relations in the future. It's difficult to do that in the present in the way that we're currently configured. But if you're actually able to put it into a more imaginative kind of future, then you're really able to sort of draw on the imaginative juices that we have, on the creativity that we have as a species, And that might be able, that could be a spark to a very different kind of conversation about where it is we need to go.